Good morning and welcome. My name is Andrew Senchak, and I am a 9/11 Memorial and Museum board member and co-chair of the board's Education Committee. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this very special program. I'd like to acknowledge in particular our museum members in attendance, as well as the students from the High School of Economics and Finance. Where are they sitting? Very good. Okay. Study hard on economics and finance. I encourage you. And also the Urban Assembly School of Emergency Management. And where are you? Over there. Okay. We need you too. And I'd like to also welcome my fellow board member, Monica Eichen. Where are you, Monica? Aye. And members of the FBI's New York office's executive management team. I assume we don't want you to identify yourselves. And the Norwegian Consulate General, Harriet E. Berg, who denies, she says she's neither a Mets nor a Yankees fan. And our special thanks to Harriet and the Norwegian Consulate General for their support of this event. We are honored to hear today from Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Mr. Stoltenberg was born in Oslo, Norway, and had a distinguished career in politics, culminating in his tenure as Norway's Prime Minister from 2005 to 2013. On July 22nd, 2011, Norway faced the worst terrorist attack in its modern history, when a single terrorist killed 77 people in two sequenced attacks. First, by setting off a bomb in the government center in Oslo, killing 8 people, and soon after, attacking a youth camp associated with Norway's Labour Party, Mr. Stoltenberg's party, his political home on a small island near Oslo, killing 69 people, most of them teenagers. Mr. Stoltenberg took on the task of rallying and reassuring his country. His declaration on the evening of July 22nd has frequently been cited as a defining moment in Norwegian history. This is his quote: "The answer to the attacks must be more democracy and more openness. Otherwise, those who were behind them will have achieved their goals." This, I believe, is probably the proper response that we can all make to all terrorist attacks. And I thank him for saying it. Thank you. On September 12, 2001, NATO invoked its Mutual Defense Clause for the first and only time in its history. The invocation of Article 5, which states that an armed attack against one member shall be considered an attack against them all, ultimately sent thousands of Allied troops to fight alongside Americans in Afghanistan. More than 1,000 NATO military members died in honoring this commitment. These experiences have given Mr. Stoltenberg a deep appreciation of the importance of remembering and of the importance of the interaction of memory and values. Today is his 3rd visit to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. I am also very proud to note that the museum has provided ongoing advice to the development of Norway's memorial response to the July 22nd attacks. In that spirit, we are going to make a gift of the survivor tree seedling to NATO for planting it at its Brussels headquarters near the World Trade Center steel that has already been installed there. We'll hear today from Mr. Stoltenberg about NATO's enduring commitment to the fight against terrorism. His speech will be followed by a moderated conversation led by the Memorial's Museum Executive Vice President and Deputy Director of Programs, Cliff Channon. Please join me in welcoming the Secretary of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg.
So thank you so much, Andrew, and many thanks to all of you for welcoming me here today. As you mentioned, this is my third visit. I remember last time, I think that's 3 years ago. Then we started to discuss whether I should come back and to give a speech. And we have struggled since then to find a time, but now we actually finally succeeded. So therefore, I'm very glad that I'm able to be here once again, and this time to actually say some words and also to answer some questions. At the entrance to NATO's new headquarters in Brussels, a twisted piece of metal stands vigil. It is a rusted 6-foot section of a steel girder that was recovered from this spot in the ruins of the Twin Towers. This is a fragment of American history, which is also an important part of NATO's history. And I want to thank the National September 11 Memorial for making it available to NATO. It serves as a powerful symbol of the enduring partnership and friendship between the United States and its NATO allies across Europe and Canada. It is also a daily reminder of the deadly dangers posed by terrorism, the importance of standing together to protect our people and our values. Coming here to Ground Zero is a time for solemn reflection, a time to pay tribute to the innocent victims of 9/11, a time to remember the suffering, the sorrow, and the staggering loss on that terrible day. But let us also recall the sense of community and the common purpose that emerge from the wreckage. The goal of terrorism is always to spread fear and to sow discord and division and disunity. Our response to terrorism in all its forms, wherever it appears, is to unite and stand up for our open and free societies. We have many different tools in the fight against terrorism, and we need to use them all, because terrorism comes in many different forms and wears many different guises. It rears its head in conflicts far away, but also in our own cities. To fight radicalization at home, we need social workers, teachers and religious leaders, poets and artists, people from all walks of life. We need our police and our intelligence services. To bring an end to conflicts which fuel terrorism, we need political, diplomatic and economic efforts. And we need military might. NATO's involvement in the fight against terrorism stems directly from the 9/11 attacks on the United States. For the first and only time in NATO's history, we invoked our Article 5, our collective defense clause of our founding treaty, which states that an attack against one is an attack against all allies. In the days that followed the 9/11 attack, NATO planes helped to patrol American skies. Soon after, troops from NATO allies deployed to Afghanistan to prevent that country from ever again becoming a safe haven for international terrorists. Since then, hundreds of thousands of troops from America's NATO allies and our partners have stood shoulder to shoulder with American soldiers in Afghanistan. More than 1,000 have paid the ultimate price. And today, NATO allies continue to stand with the United States. in Afghanistan and elsewhere. All NATO allies take part in the global coalition to defeat ISIS. NATO provides surveillance aircraft and training. We have taught counterterrorism tactics in countries like Egypt, Mauritania, and Morocco, and our troops are helping to develop special forces in Jordan and Tunisia. We recently decided to boost NATO's contribution to the fight against terrorism with a new training mission in Iraq and more support for our partners in the Middle East and North Africa. We also agreed to sustain our military and financial support for Afghanistan. Training local forces is one of the best weapons we have in the fight against terrorism, because prevention is better than intervention. Instead of deploying large number of combat forces in combat missions and operations, it is more sustainable to help our neighbors to stabilize their own countries. If our neighbors are more stable, we are more secure. Visiting this solemn space reminds us of what is at stake. So I want to thank you for creating this poignant and powerful memorial and museum, along with educational programs about the 9/11 attacks and terrorism, helping to bolster our resilience and reminding us who we are. Your guidance and inspiration have been helpful to other countries and communities that have suffered from terrorism. I was Prime Minister in Norway on the 22nd of July 2011, a date that will live in infamy in the history of our small country. 77 innocent men and women, boys and girls, were cold-heartedly killed by a hate-filled white Norwegian with an extremist ideology and a willingness to use indiscriminate violence against innocent civilians. In the years since then, Norway has benefited from the invaluable insights from the National September 11 Memorial, helping Norway to heal and to reaffirm our own memorials in a strong resolve to preserve freedom and to end hatred and intolerance. In Norway, at Utøya, the island that was attacked, we created a memory tree, inspired by the survivor tree here at Ground Zero. A month after the Twin Towers fell, workers uncovered the last living thing to emerge from the rubble. Only a few signs of life, a few determined leaves remained. For 9 years, the survivor tree was lovingly nursed back to health, and then returned here to the Memorial Plaza in 2010. A phoenix risen from the ashes. You have donated seedlings from the survivor tree to communities that have been scarred by tragedies, here in the United States and abroad. A living symbol of hope, renewal, and rebirth. And I am really honored that you are donating one of the survivor tree seedlings to be planted at the NATO headquarters in Brussels. A living companion of that twisted piece of metal from the rubble of the Twin Towers. It will commemorate the thousands of NATO soldiers who have given their lives in fighting terrorism. So now I would like to present 2 gifts of my own to the National 9/11 Memorial and Museum. One is a photograph of our 9/11 and Article 5 memorial at the entrance to the NATO headquarters. The second is a copy of NATO's founding treaty. The treaty enshrines the enduring partnership between North America and Europe, and our binding commitment to democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. Values that strengthen us and will help us prevail over hatred, violence, and intolerance. So I don't know who's going to receive the gift, but one of you have to come up, and then all of you. Yeah. So this is the picture, and this is actually from here, and we inaugurated this piece, this steel girder, at the NATO summit or NATO leaders meeting in May 2017. Yeah. So that was a great event, and it stands there. Everyone who goes into the NATO headquarters, they have to pass this piece from the Twin Tower, and it's the 9/11 Article 5 memorial, because as you said, this was the first and only time we invoked Article 5, and so far our biggest military operation ever is a direct consequence of the terrorist attacks here at Ground Zero. So that's the first gift. Yeah. Thank you.
Let me take the next one.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, we'll go over here.
Yeah, so that's oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Come into the light. All right.
A picture of the picture. Okay, and then I have one more.
Yeah.
And that's this one. This is actually our founding treaty. The good thing is that actually there are many international treaties which are very long and very complicated. This is very brief and very easy to understand. So that shows the greatness of the people who created the Washington Treaty back in 1949. And it actually briefly just says that if one ally is attacked, we are all under attack. So this is NATO founding treaty.
And in return, whenever we get gifts, we give trees back. But in return, the Secretary General did mention our intention to make the donation of the seedling, which will be planted at NATO headquarters. So we'll
Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you.
put this over here. If you would take a seat. Good. Okay. Well, thank you again on all of our behalfs for coming here and making time in your schedule. You spoke to obvious moving effect about the attack in Norway, your role as Prime Minister. I wonder the impact that you saw that having within Norwegian society, and the impact of that on you, particularly as you moved into the role of NATO Secretary General.
The impact on Norway was, I think, that in one way we lost our innocence, because we thought that this was something that couldn't happen in Norway. Terrorism, terrorist attacks was something that could happen in other countries, but not in Norway. And then suddenly it happened in Norway, and it not only happened in Norway, but the scale and the scope of that terrorist attack is one of the biggest in Europe over many, many years. So of course, if you measure the number of casualties, it's much bigger what happened here. But if you measure against other terrorist attacks in Europe or against the size of the Norwegian population, 5 million, then this was really something really big, really awful, and also the character of the violence shocked us all. The strength was, and what I think impressed us all, was the way the Norwegian people reacted, because instead of hatred and in a way revenge, it was about tolerance, democracy, openness, to guard those principles and those values that were under attack. And there were many expressions of that, but one of the strongest expressions was what we call the rose marches, or hundreds of thousands of people walking out in the streets, expressing their support for open and free Norwegian society, and I think we have been able to maintain a high level of trust and openness in Norway. Then you asked me
about the Secretary General's role.
And to be honest, it has been extremely useful. Perhaps that's the wrong thing to say, but I think that for me it is useful to have been so close to a terrorist attack. Because when I came to NATO, of course, it was about a more assertive Russia, Ukraine, and the challenges in the East. But I came to NATO when we really had to step up in the fight against Daesh, ISIS in Iraq, Syria, when we saw many serious terrorist attacks in our own streets, in Paris, in Brussels, in London, and elsewhere. So terrorism came very high on my agenda. And I met and I talked to many political leaders in all the NATO allies who suffered terrorist attacks. And for me to be able to share with them the experience, the importance of uniting against our values. I remember, for instance, we marched in the streets of Paris, many political leaders from European countries and elsewhere. And that was not the same as the Rose marches in Oslo, but it was something similar. People going out in the streets saying that we don't want to be intimidated, we don't want to be scared, we want to protect the normal life of people living in Paris, going to cafes, living normal lives. So it has been an advantage for me to have my experience from Norway when I discuss these issues with political leaders in other NATO allied countries as Secretary General.
Yes, you speak about the importance of values, and these are what underpin NATO. You talk about these efforts to remember is also a matter of remembering who we are. And yet, I wonder if you find, given the political turmoil in many countries, the tensions within all kinds of societies, do you think that we, whoever we are, do we still agree on what our values are, or is there something fundamentally being contested right now?
Fundamentally, I think we agree and understand the value of open, free societies. Again, depending a bit on who we are. So, and at least I think and as soon as those values are under real threat, at least we understand how important they are. Either under real threat from terrorist organizations, from terrorist threats, or from governments or adversaries. So I think the danger is that sometimes when you take these values for granted, you forget, or it's easy to forget how important it is to uphold them and to defend them. Then I think that what we have to admit is that sometimes we have different views on how we best protect them, and actually how we practice these values in the best possible way. And this is, of course, a bit sensitive because this is also a discussion inside the alliance. But fundamentally, I think that there is a broad understanding of the value of open, free societies, and the main response from NATO allies when they are under terrorist attack is to unite around those values.
You spoke about the challenges that the alliance faces, and I wanted to turn immediately to the question of Russia. And obviously, Russia is an adversary, if that's the right word, to the United States, of course, to the NATO alliance. Describe, if you would, the strategy that you see the Russians putting into play here, whether it's in terms of military efforts or in terms of efforts to undermine the confidence of societies in the values you've just described.
So what we see is a more assertive Russia, and Russia uses both the tools you mentioned. They use military efforts, military capabilities. We have seen that in Ukraine, illegally annexing Crimea. We have seen it, for instance, in Syria, where they also provide as a strong and very powerful support for the Assad regime with military means. But they also use what we call hybrid techniques or tactics, which is, more covert tools or activities, meddling in political processes in different member states and partner nations of NATO, disinformation and propaganda, And the whole thing is that if one NATO ally is under attack, armed attack, then we trigger the Article 5 and we defend each other. And we have done a lot over the recent years to improve our capability to do exactly that. The challenge now is that we are challenged with what we call tools or activities below Article 5. So it's not so serious, not so visible, not so overt that we can react by invoking Article 5. For instance, disinformation. We saw the Skripal case. We saw recently Greece expelled some Russian officials that were meddling in the political process in Greece related to the name agreement between Greece and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Very important issue in that part of Europe. So NATO has to be able to respond both to an armed attack, which is something we have prepared for and planned for 70 years, but we also need to be able to respond to something which is below a full armed attack. And that's about intelligence, that's about cyber, improving our cyber defenses. That's about also meeting the disinformation and the propaganda. And that's part about NATO providing facts and countering some of the disinformation which is out there, or helping member states to do so. But I think one of the most important things we do to counter disinformation and propaganda is to stand up for a free and open press, or free and open media. Because at the end of the day, it has to be the media, journalists, that asks the difficult questions, that check their sources, and are able to discover when another state tries to meddle in political processes in one or another NATO ally.
This meddling in the political processes is said to be part of the Russian strategy, Putin's strategy, to essentially put a wedge into the alliance so that some members become weaker. And as we say, you're only as strong as your weakest link. Would you agree with that assessment? And do you think he has, or the Russians have made headway in that regard?
I think as Russia tries to divide us, Russia don't like NATO. That's and that's fair enough. They disagree with us. They don't like the idea that we stand together, and that's a Russian position. And of course, they would regard it as a great success if they were able to divide us. And to be honest, we see some divisions within allies, or between allies. Not only initiated by Russia, but for different reasons, we see differences between NATO allies. What I say when I'm confronted with that is that NATO is an alliance of 29 democracies on both sides of the Atlantic, and there has been and there will be differences between different independent nations with different culture, different history, different political parties in government, so there will be differences. The strength of NATO is that we, despite these differences, we have always been able to unite around our core task, and that is to protect and defend each other. So as long as we are able to continue to do that, we can live with differences. Actually, differences open the discussions, disagreements. It's not always a sign of weakness. It's very often a sign of strength, as long as we are able to unite around our core task. And I'm afraid this answer is a bit long, but let me add that.
No, please.
Because sometimes we forget that we have seen serious disagreements between NATO allies before. I watch the TV series The Crown, so I learn a lot from that. TV series are very, don't tell anyone, but it's very useful to watch. And one of the episodes there is about the Suez Crisis. Which was a big crisis in the relationship between U.S. and France and United Kingdom. They went into military action against Egypt, and the United States was against, and it was really it really created a really bad relationship between the United States and two main European NATO allies. And Eden had to, it was a political crisis in UK. Well, that was during the coldest period of the Cold War, and NATO continued to deliver deterrence and defense despite the Suez Crisis. 10 years later, NATO used to have its headquarters not in Brussels, but in Paris. And I've seen the beautiful building with where the NATO headquarters used to be, with a view to the Eiffel Tower, and we had both our civilian headquarters and our military headquarters in Brussels. Then in '67, the relationship between President Johnson and President de Gaulle turned not so very constructive, so we just had to leave. And we left. And I was not attending NATO meetings at that time, but I guess the meetings were not the best atmosphere you have seen. And then some years later, we disagreed on the Iraq War. Some allies were heavily involved in the Iraq War, 2003. Other allies were strongly against. We have been able to overcome all these differences and disagreements and still be the most successful, the strongest alliance in history, protecting each other. So we cannot guarantee that NATO will always be able to overcome disagreements, but at least we have proven that we are able to do it. And my ambition, my task, my responsibility is to make sure that despite the differences we see, we should be able to do it also in the future.
Thank you. Speaking of some differences, there's been talk about the contribution of various NATO members to the budgets of their own militaries and therefore to the alliance. I wonder if you could speak about the NATO response to the President's comments about this, and also in relation to that, whether you think the bottom line of budget contributions is the way to assess the value of the alliance.
First, NATO allies have agreed to invest more in defense, not to please the United States, but because it is in our own security interest to strengthen our collective defense. Then, in addition, when European allies and Canada invest more, we also contribute to a fairer burden sharing within the alliance, which I think is fair because the burden sharing now is imbalanced. The GDP of the gross domestic product of the United States is approximately as big as the gross domestic product of European NATO allies. Despite that, the US spends more than twice as much on defense. So therefore we have agreed that those who are spending less than 2% of GDP on defense should increase and reach the 2% guideline. The good news is that that's exactly what the European allies have started to do. They still have a long way to go, but after years of cutting or declines in defense budgets, we now see an increase. Last year we had the biggest increase in defense spending since the end of the Cold War, more than 5%. And just over the 2 last years, we had more than 41 billion extra US dollars from Canada and the United States invested in defense. So I agree we need the fair burden sharing. And the good news is that we have started to deliver on that. But still we have a long way to go. In 2014, when we made this decision, it was actually only 3 allies that met the 2% guideline. This year we expect 8 allies to meet the 2% guideline, and even those who are below have started to move towards the 2% guideline, so it's going in the right direction. Then you asked me whether defense spending is the only way to measure it. No, of course not. NATO is a political and military alliance. We need to deliver military strength, collective defense, but we need also to deliver political efforts, diplomatic efforts. I'm strongly in favor of dialogue with Russia, for instance, to try to diffuse tensions, to avoid a new arms race. So we have many other tasks than just deliver military strength. And let me also add that I was Minister of Finance back in the 1990s in Norway, and I was able to cut defense budgets. I'm really good at that. I know exactly how to do it. It's just to contrast military spending with healthcare, and then I know, and I'm not ashamed of that, because the thing is that it's possible to reduce defense spending when tensions are going down. And after the end of the Cold War, after the Berlin Wall came down and the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, then it was actually the right thing to do to cut or reduce defense spending. So you can do that when tensions are going down, as long as you're able to increase defense spending when tensions are going up, as they are doing now. So therefore, therefore I'm now a strong advocate for increased investments in defense.
You mentioned Afghanistan in your remarks, and it's 17 years that combat has been underway there with the United States and its NATO allies. In this country, certainly, there is a sense of, does this ever end? Are we going to be there forever? Because we've been there the longest military engagement we've had. What do you see as the end game in Afghanistan? And this debate in the US that I've mentioned about whether we should continue this commitment, do you see that debate being duplicated in some of the NATO countries that have been there for so long as well?
So, as we have been there for 17 years, and I think it's fair and right to ask questions about whether it's right to continue. Because we should not only continue just because we have been there. We need a deliberate decision. We need some real assessments about whether to stay or not before we make our decisions. And we have done that, and we need, of course, also to continue to do that. But the conclusion has been that we should stay. Mainly because there are high costs related to staying in Afghanistan. We have more than 16,000 NATO troops there in a train, assist and advise mission. It's a high financial cost, and it's a political cost, and of course it is a human cost. We still have some casualties. But when you compare the cost of staying with the cost of leaving, our conclusion is that the cost of leaving is higher. Because if we leave Afghanistan, I think we have to be prepared for that Taliban will come back. And ISIS is in Afghanistan, and they will try to re-establish the caliphate they lost in Iraq and Syria. They will re-establish in Afghanistan. So that's the most likely outcome if we leave. So then if we leave, we have to be prepared to stay out of Afghanistan, even though Afghanistan once again becomes a safe haven for international terrorists. And they start to train, organize, plan, finance terrorist attacks on our own countries from Afghanistan. And if we were able to promise ourselves that despite that we will not go back, then it's possible to leave. But I don't think we will not be willing to watch that happen. So then we will leave, stay out for some years, and be forced back again. And that's the worst possible alternative. And we have to remember that the reason why we are in Afghanistan is very much because of what happened here. We have to remember that not NATO, because NATO was not present as an alliance, but NATO allies left Iraq in 2011. Then a few years later, we were all back. All of us, from the left to the right, everyone. So I was against the Iraq war in 2003. All those politicians I know that was against the Iraq war in 2003, they were in favor of going back now. So it's only if you really believe that we are willing to stay out and watch ISIS, Khorasan, which is the Afghan branch of ISIS, take over and say, no, just continue, we will not go back, then you can leave. So I'm back to my main point. There is no easy way out. There is no easy solution. There is no solution in Afghanistan without costs. But the cost of leaving is, best of my best judgment, higher than the cost of staying. Add to that our presence in Afghanistan now is totally different than what is different from what it was at the beginning. Because for many years we had a big combat operation in Afghanistan, where we had more than 100,000 troops. And when there was a Taliban attack, it was US forces or Danish forces or Norwegian forces that went out and responded to the Taliban attack. Now it's the Afghans themselves. They go out. They are in the front line. We help them, we train them, we fund them, but we have gone from more than 100,000 troops in the combat operation to 16,000 troops in the train, assist and advise mission. US do some counterterrorism on top of that, but still it's a totally different presence and therefore a much more enduring and sustainable presence. And that's the reason why I said in my speech that prevention is better than intervention. The best thing we can do to fight international terrorism is to train local forces, as we have done in Afghanistan, and help them. The last thing about Afghanistan, it is really serious. I mean, the Taliban is there, ISIS is there, many different terrorist groups are there. So I'm not saying that this is a straightforward, easy way, but I'm saying that the alternative is worse.
Let me follow up on that because, implicit in your remarks that if we go, the Taliban will succeed, it casts some question about the effectiveness of the training operation, how long this will go on, and whether or not, under any circumstances and under any length of time, it can be effective. So how do you assess the effectiveness of that mission and whether or not at some point there will be a possibility of a further reduction of NATO troops, if not a complete withdrawal?
I think that if there's any lesson we have learned from Afghanistan is that we should have started the training and the capacity building earlier. But we have at least succeeded in building and train Afghan forces and police, which are now, they are able to hold the main cities, the ground in most of the provinces in Afghanistan. Again, it's not easy, but for instance, the stated goal of Taliban this year was to take control over one of the provincial capitals. They have not succeeded in that. Taliban controls territory in Afghanistan. They pose a constant threat, but at least we have the Afghan army and security forces being in the front line, being responsible for security in their own country. Well, the aim, the way to leave Afghanistan is to be able to reach a political solution, and therefore we strongly support the bold and new initiatives by President Ghani to really engage in a political peace process with Taliban. The US is also engaging now in political process or peace efforts with Taliban, and hopefully that can lead to something. I don't think that we will ever see Afghanistan, as stable and as peaceful as, our own countries, but at least that we can come in a situation where it's responsible to leave. We will not stay longer in Afghanistan than necessary, but we will stay as long as is needed to prevent Afghanistan from once again becoming a safe haven for international terrorists. And we are staying there now to also send a clear message to Taliban that they will not win on the battlefield, so they have to sit down at the negotiating table and then reach a political compromise with the government in Kabul.
Let me ask, as Secretary General, you obviously get a very strong sense of the impact of the fighting in Afghanistan on the different partner militaries. Two questions, and these have been raised in relation to the United States military and its role in fighting both Afghanistan and Iraq. One, certainly the capacities to fight this kind of war seem to have improved. And so there is a more effective way of doing this, it seems, over time. On the other hand, it takes you away from, in the case of NATO, what the core business is, which is the defense of Europe and certainly the original idea of this Soviet-Russian threat. So how would you assess the impact on the militaries that have been in Afghanistan for these 17 years in these two senses?
I think that what happened after 9/11 and when NATO started, we actually started to happen a bit before, because it started when we went into Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo, very different, but at least we started then to have military operations out of area. And for people who are as old as I am, I remember that in the 80s, it was a big discussion whether NATO should go out of area, meaning go out of so have any military presence outside NATO allied territory. And while we had this more theoretical debate, we suddenly saw the Berlin Wall came down, and people started to ask, do we need NATO anymore? Because the reason why we existed was in the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, and that just disappeared. And then people said that NATO either had to go out of area, meaning beyond NATO territory, or out of business. And we went not out of business, but out of area. First, helping to end two wars in the Balkans, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, Serbia, and then later on Afghanistan and fighting piracy and elsewhere. what that did with our armed forces is that we transformed our armed forces from more static, collective defense, heavy armor, heavy troops, high-end capabilities in Europe to more light expeditionary forces in the mountains of Afghanistan. And that's totally different concept, totally different equipment, totally different training. So we transformed it from collective defense in Europe to expeditionary forces able to deploy quickly all over the world or far away. And it also increased what we call interoperability, because we had, for the first time in our history, then troops from different NATO allies and partner countries really working together in military operations. NATO had not fired one single shot before we went beyond NATO territory into the Balkans and later in Afghanistan. So that's in a way, that developed our military capabilities. The challenge was that it weakened our ability to do the traditional collective defense in Europe. For, as I said, one way, good reasons, because tensions went down. We didn't see Russia as a real challenge anymore, so we could divert our resources to something else. The challenge now is that we have to go back to do more collective defense, more the old, also traditional deterrence defense in Europe, with armor, with heavy equipment, with all that. But at the same time, we need to continue to manage crisis beyond our borders. So, for 40 years, NATO did only one thing, that was collective defense in Europe from 49 to 89. Then for 25 years, we reduced our, as I say, focus on collective defense. We were an expeditionary alliance doing something far away. Now, we have to continue to be far away in operations like Afghanistan and to do collective defense in Europe at the same time. So for the first time in NATO's history, we need to do crisis management and collective defense at the same time. And that's the big transformation of NATO, which has taken place over the last 4 or 5 years, and which we have so far successfully been able to implement.
Thank you. We're going to take a couple of questions, and we have seated a couple in the audience. We have, as you know, students from the High School of Economics and Finance and the Urban Assembly School for Emergency Management, and we've asked those schools each to prepare a question. So I'm going to call first on Jessica. Where are you, Jessica? Somewhere. There you are. Please stand up. You'll take the microphone and ask a question, please, for the Secretary General.
What do you think your challenges are for the next 10 to 15 years?
I think it's very hard to predict because all those people who are in the business of predicting, they are normally totally wrong. In one way, it's a big surprise how many people can have so many exams and PhDs and in so many different fields, and they are always wrong.
That's very reassuring.
No, but not always, but at least they are not very clever at predicting the future. And I worked for 2 years in the Central Bureau of Statistics in Norway, and then I worked together with some people that were predicting oil prices. That was a total catastrophe. We were, and we actually, what we started to do, and now we have done that for some years because we are very dependent on oil prices in Norway, and we have started to do something I think which is very interesting. We're looking backwards, and then we compare our predictions 5, 10, 20 years ago with what actually happened, and it illustrates that there's a totally big gap. The reality is that when prices are going up, we predict they will continue to go up, and when they're going down, we predict they will continue to go down. Approximately something like that. But we pay a lot for all this analysis. But then you have social sciences. As an economist, we love mathematics and we have models and so on, but we are still wrong on the oil prices. Not always wrong, but I mean oil prices. I remember a debate in Norway with some experts on foreign and security issues. The spring '89. And I will not mention the names of those experts because that will be an insult. They were sitting there and they were asked, do you think the Berlin Wall can come down? No. No way. Perestroika and glasnost, that's possible. That would change Russia and as the Soviet Union, but the Berlin Wall, that will still, it will stand. Then months later, it just went down. And then the same experts are experts in explaining why it went down. And we pay them for that too. So they're good at businesses also. Yeah. And then the Arab Spring or 9/11. I mean, when we in NATO had analyzed what kind of threats and challenges we were going to face, not many people were able to predict 9/11. And if you asked experts, as I was not going around in NATO, but I think very much that if you asked experts back in 2001, when will be, or before 9/11, what will be the first case when NATO invokes Article 5, no one would have said a terrorist attack on the United States. The whole idea with Article 5 was to defend European allies against Soviet Union sending their battle tanks over something called the Fulda Gap in Germany. So the reason why I say all this is that when you hear people start to predict what will happen in 10, 15 years, you should always be very suspicious. But, yeah, so thank you. No,
Here we go.
Yeah, but what you can do is to be prepared for the unforeseen, to have a strategy to deal with surprises, to have a strategy to deal with uncertainty. And what we did in Norway was that we were less focused on our ability to predict oil prices, because we were always wrong about that. But we developed a strategy to how to deal with fluctuations in oil prices and fluctuation in oil revenues. So we invented a pension fund, which is a beautiful thing in Norway. Yeah. So then, I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but since we're not able to predict also 10, 15 years about the oil price, we created a mechanism to deal with uncertainty. And that's exactly the same we have to do when it comes to security. That I cannot tell you exactly what will be the main challenge or the main threat or the main something in 10, 15 years. But I can tell you that if we stand together, if we have a strong transatlantic bond, North America and Europe together, then we are much more capable of dealing with those threats, challenges, whatever they may be. And that if we have capable forces, high readiness, good intelligence, situational awareness, then we can deal with short-term and long-term surprises. So instead of now listing all, we have a more resort to Russia, we have terrorism, we have cyber, it's easy to list a lot of potential things that may or may not happen. My focus is less on trying to predict that, because I will not be able to do so. More on how to be able to react, to deal with, and manage if and when surprises happen.
Thank you. Also, speaking of uncertainty and preparing for it, we have a question from Emmanuel from the Urban Assembly School for Emergency Management. So where is Emmanuel? Please stand up.
Thank you.
Your friends are with you.
So you said that it can be difficult to tell what the main issues or like the main problems you might face in the future are. So just to narrow that down, what effects do you think the current US administration will have on NATO in the future?
We left the best for last.
Yeah, no, but but I think what we see now is that well, we are an alliance of 29 different nations with different political leaders with different political opinions about many things. And we also see that there are some serious disagreements between different NATO allies, but also sometimes between the US and other NATO allies on important issues as trade, tariffs, the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, and other issues. And my strategy or my response to that is that, well, the best thing would be if we were able to solve those disagreements on trade, on climate change. But as long as we are not able to solve these disagreements on trade, tariffs, climate, whatever, then it is my and NATO's responsibility to make sure that those disagreements doesn't undermine the core of the transatlantic partnership, that we protect and defend each other. So meaning that yes, there are differences, but so far, and I really believe that we will be able to do that also in the future, we have been able to maintain the security cooperation, meaning that what we see now is actually that the United States is not withdrawing its presence or reducing its presence in Europe, but actually the United States is increasing its military presence in Europe. For the first time after many, many years where the United States actually reduced its presence, the United States is now increasing its military presence in Europe. So actions speak louder than words. The US have more troops, more exercises. They recently just announced some more troops to Germany, more pre-positioned equipment. Even in Norway, the US have now some Marines. So those who question the security relationship between Europe and North America, my answer to them is that no, actually we deliver. We had a successful summit where we made more than 100 concrete decisions on higher readiness, on new command structure, on reforming NATO, on a new training mission in Iraq. So actually we decided that North America and Europe should do more together, not less. And the US is proving that by what they actually do on the ground in Europe. So I'm not absolutely certain what you asked me about, but the thing is that, there are differences, and we saw that also during the general debate in the UN yesterday, that there are differences on issues between NATO allies and also with the United States and President Trump, but we have proven that we're able to maintain, and not only maintain but strengthen the cooperation within NATO. Yeah, so that was. I would just add one thing which is not related to this, but I think it's important for me to say it about Russia, because we are responding to Russia. We are not mirroring exactly plane by plane or tank by tank or whatever what Russia does, but we are responding to the actions of Russia in Ukraine, in Georgia, and elsewhere. But we are not. But we want to avoid the new Cold War. We want to avoid a new arms race, and we are striving for a better relationship with Russia. And I strongly believe in dialogue with Russia, because Russia is there to stay. Russia is our neighbor, and we need to find a way to live with Russia. We will all be losers if we move into a new Cold War. And therefore the strategy of NATO towards Russia is what we call deterrence, defense, and dialogue. And I met with the Minister Lavrov yesterday, and we disagree on many issues, for instance Ukraine, but we agree on the need for political dialogue between NATO and Russia, because we need to diffuse tensions. Okay.
Thank you. That is all we have time for. Let me ask that when you leave the auditorium, you leave through the rear doors, not through the front, through the rear. Oh, I just checking. You are a Norwegian, not an American citizen.
No,
yes? Yeah, that's too bad. But please join me in thanking the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg.